Thank you so much for joining us. It's really such a treat to share time and space with you both. Can we get started with a brief introduction to who you are and how you might summarize your practices?
I think maybe we could talk about what we each did before we started doing things together, and then maybe what we do together and why that is so thrilling. So I make primarily short experimental film and video works, and I guess in the spirit of performance for the camera, and have done that obsessively since about 1995. I also, I guess, would, like to suggest that the works are expanded in the form of installations, multi-channel installations that are multisensorial, and have also experimented recently with vibrotactile and vibrational haptics alongside the works for accessibility, but also for these more kind of, I guess, corporeally integrated experiences for artists and audiences. And have for many years also worked alongside that in parallel, running artist-run centers like the Images Festival and Art Site. And I now work at VTape, which is a video art distribution organization, surrounding myself with like-minded people in that sense, so that I can also, embark on the dissemination of film and video, experimental film and video works, and the research resources that accompany those works critically and curatorially. And have worked also with organizations like Carfax National, Media Arts Ontario, places like the Film Farm, where I'm also engaged in larger issues related to technologies and politics around cultural production and its consumption.
Allyson.
And about, I would say when I was working at the Images Festival, in about 1994, or no, 6 or 7, I met Allyson Mitchell, and the whole world changed.
Well, after 10 years.
Well,
we got together 10 years after that, after we met. In 2003, we got together. And before 2003, and largely into 2003, I was doing performance with a fat activist group called Pretty Porky and Pissed Off, and doing large scale, well, it didn't start off as large scale, but started with small scale, craft-based activist art, stickers, zines, performance, that kind of stuff, and then became more large scale installations, including like a coven of lesbian feminist Sasquatches and utopic lesbian library. So these are kind of like the larger scale things, but also still doing smaller things and performance and video. My work has always been very scattered across disciplines. And I'm also a professor in gender and women's studies at York University. And my work is often about trying to make accessible feminist and queer and other social justice or critical theories, make them accessible by making them material, by creating installations that people can experience in the round. Yeah, so there's lots to say about that, but I'm not going to say more. And then, so fast forward 2003, we get together, boom.
Shazam.
I said I'd never collaborate with a partner again. Eventually, I get worn down, and we start the end exhilarated by the idea of starting a feminist art gallery together called FAG in our garage, in our backyard in Toronto. And kind of parallel was also this gigantic project called Killjoy's Castle, a lesbian feminist haunted house that we collaborated on over the past 10 years, almost 10 years, not quite 10 years.
Time stands still.
Yeah. In Toronto, We did it in Los Angeles, we did it in Philadelphia, and we did a slice of it in London, England. So, and we collaborated on that. So, and now we've moved to the country and ... stuff to say about that. But that is in a nutshell our practices and how we
now find ourselves in deep collaborative codependence.
Even though I said I never would.
Even
And
though
she never was
listen,
a collaborator.
I mean, my work is all about discomfort.
It's secret
and
too. When she was working on video stuff, I'd be like, what are you working on? And she'd be like, never mind.
I'd be like Golem. I'd be like,
well, and my practice is completely opposite, where I'm like, I'm thinking of doing this thing that's going to probably kill me. What do you think?
and I'm like, I'll get the ladder and the first aid kit. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
And we have literally, I mean, I can say this with total honesty. Almost everything we make is extremely challenging and very complicated, from material as well as physical, as well as social and political
And don't forget
perspectives. Oh, financially bankrupting.
Well, not quite, but
Well, not quite. That's
close.
true.
Anyway, let's get on to the next question before we get into the private financial.
Was there anything we missed?
So if we're going to move on to a question about feminism, art, and feminist art, maybe the link to your introductions is something about all of the different kinds of activisms that you've talked about, and maybe if you could think about that definition through the lens of its intersections with the other communities and fights that you're involved in. But also think about whether there is some way in which feminist art, feminism stands alone in your thinking and in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the perspective is on feminism. I mean, when we started the Feminist Art Gallery, it was intended to be intersectionally feminist. So it wasn't what you would call a women's art project, which would be like a single issue kind of politic. But it was always meant to be a project that was attempting to practice intersectional feminism. So it wasn't just about cisgender people, it wasn't just about white women. And so our attempts to build an audience and support artists who were outside of those categories was us trying to also learn as white, cis, queer women, settlers, how to unlearn what we knew, recognize our privileges, and also where we couldn't see or know because of our limited education and exposure, or intentional white supremacist colonial perspectives that we'd been brought up in.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like FAG was really, for us personally, some of the beginning steps of trying to figure out how to undo that. And when we entered it, we thought it was largely through or unlearn that and learn different things. And we borrowed some methods from feminist organizing that we knew of and queer organizing, like trying to decenter ourselves. So that there's two pieces that can demonstrate that. One, at the beginning of the process of creating the Feminist Art Gallery, we invited a community of people to come in to our house and workshop with us what that could be, like a community consultation.
There were some very interesting ideas, I can tell you that.
Do you want to say those ideas? Or?
Well, I think one of the things that was explosive for me was that there were so many ideas for what one could be like. And, you know, my tendency is to draw out ideas through desperation and frustration. So my frustration as a cultural worker with this museum system was extreme at one point in my life. And I really felt physically that museums were beyond inaccessible. They were actually a form of oppression. So I was always involved in organizations and projects that would trouble those systems, find alternatives to those systems. The Artist Run Center system is one, but then became, over many years, like baby versions of museums, which and big public galleries, which is, in my mind, a great loss. The maverick spirit of those organizations almost automatically through the funding system. Again, you know, we need money. It's like, actually, you just need a couch. You don't really need money. You can drag a couch out of the garbage. You need gathering spaces. You need conversations. You need debate. So the Feminist Art Gallery, the idea that people had effervescent and radical ideas for what a Feminist Art Gallery could do for, in particular, emerging BIPOC artists was liberating. We also, just so we're clear, popped a fortune out of a fortune cookie that said, you can always depend on the trust of the collective. And we blew it up really big, and we're talking supersized, and we put it on the wall in our house, and we thought about it for a long time and realized that it would have to be a collective effort. So many, or a collective entity, and in many ways, we don't mean that like a collective ran it, but that we literally would give it the shape that was demanded by an artist or someone who wanted to come and do a writing retreat, or someone who wanted to have a show, or someone that just wanted to have dinner and meet some curators and some interesting people. And, you know, before you knew it, on Christmas Eve, people were like, is the gallery open? You know? So, you know, we had to keep undoing it over time. We also developed a mantra that I think was very valuable, and created banners for that mantra, and carried them in protests many times. And the primary one that we like to just throw out on the table is that we can't compete. So it leads to this question of refusing to compete in a system that you don't believe in. And to try and operate a gallery under those pretenses was a very complicated thing to try to do.
Yeah, and so back to that question, Michelle, too, around like some of the things that we try to do are things that are kind of obvious, like bringing trans, BIPOC artists to the front, offering them exhibitions, supporting those exhibitions with space, with funding, with food, and gathering community. So that was kind of the most obvious and clunky part. And to try to do that without doing it in a tokenizing way, but is consistent and not just once in a while for optics. And then so we're telling you the story about the beginning, and then I wanted to like kind of wrap it up by talking about what we did at the end of when we were kind of like wrapping up the Feminist Art Gallery, which was for the last year, we literally handed it over to somebody else. So we gave the gallery space over to a curatorial collective called Younger Than Beyonce, who was, I'm not sure if they're still practicing, actually. I'm so out of it due to COVID, but not that I have COVID, but I mean COVID culture. I'm not up on the art world in that way right now, but they'd lost their space. They had this really cool space, and they were getting kicked out for someone who would be paying rent. And it was always meant to be temporary. They always wanted to be a nomadic space. And so we were like, why don't you take our space for a year? We don't want to be the curators. We don't want to be the directors. We want somebody else to move it with different vision And so like they were younger than us, they're many more people than us, they're, you know, different than us in lots of ways. So that was what we did as kind of like a final gesture with that physical space.
Mm-hmm. And one more quick addition. When we were invited to do things outside of the Feminist Art Gallery, which we often were, we would kind of take the model with us. And so whenever we were invited to somewhere, to have an exhibition, we would bring the artist with us. We would ask the institution to purchase something, which often went over like a lead balloon, but it did happen. Or we would get into their collection and bring forward a kind of a feminist critique of those collections. We would continue to try to advocate for the artists that, or not advocate, but try to defer the tendency to come to us as the people running the Feminist Art Gallery instead of the artists that we were trying to put forward in the model. And we often also got lots of money to come from those institutions and go to the artists directly, as opposed to that thing that happens where it goes through the sieve of the institution, and by the time it gets to the artist, it's almost all gone. So other methodologies along with the gallery were productive up to a point, but eventually we just realized too that everyone wanted to talk to us about the Feminist Art Gallery, not as much to the artists that we wanted to foreground, or to support. So it did in that sense kind of
Skitter.
fail. Oh,
I didn't get it.
babe, you get one
Mosquito,
chance
sorry.
at that.
Anyway, that's the answer.
And we left
The
the
beginning
city,
of the end.
and we left the gallery.
But it was all about we were trying to learn how to do something differently. And we didn't really know exactly what we were doing. A lot of it was learning by practice. We made mistakes as we tried to figure it out, but it was also like a huge project that we were doing alongside our own art practices and our own jobs, which are heavy loads. So, you know, maybe the Feminist Art Gallery would have been differently practiced if it was our sole attention was on it, but also it was expansive, partly because our lives are so stretched out. It means the net we throw out to, that's like a bad metaphor, I don't know, like the please come join us or hang out with us call is it's more expansive because of where our feelers are out into the world through Killjoy's Castle, through our own practices, and through our jobs.
I love this, and it feels like a kind of brilliant setup to where you're going or where you are now. And I was wondering if you could take us from the handing over of FAG, the moving away from Toronto, and perhaps in that summary of your movement, we could talk about land-based practices, pedagogies, imaginations for the future.
Yeah. So we gave away the gallery for a year. That was really interesting and good. Learned lots from that. And then we did Killjoy's Castle in Philadelphia, which took about 1.5 years to do. And then we came home, and then the pandemic happened. Among other life circumstances. And we had actually made a life plan about 5 years ago, which we're trying to like figure out, where are we going? What are we doing? Not that we're trying to control it or direct it, but just like, what are we hoping for? What do we want to tend towards? And one thing was that in 5 years, we wanted to have a place in the world that was more green and less urban than where we were.
I was also having major climate change,
terror,
depression, terror, And I became, and I think it's very common, I was like, how do I get off the grid? What can I do? Like, we do have an individual responsibility to do something, right? And if you, and when we came out of this incredible materiality of the Killjoy's Castle project, in fact, we left the entire thing in a storage locker in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and it is still there. And we're not really sure when we're ever going to get it.
Just keep paying the rent.
It is a huge material object. It's full of people. I mean, you know, we're talking hundreds of people were in, not hundreds, over 100 people were involved in the creation of, the collaboration of, and the performance of Killjoy's Castle in Philly. But you know, you know, in contrast to that, I think artists are being asked to make decisions about the equity and the impact of their artistic production. And so I had started to feel very conflicted. We had started feeling quite conflicted about owning property, having urban lives, making giant material objects, however, and temporary ones. And however you want to like add it up, we were just starting to sort of settle back into Toronto when our organization, like York and V-Tape, closed in early March. And the life plan had said, you know, in 5 years, we wanted to have something out of the city. I mean, we may not look it, but we're in our 50s.
Yeah, we're in our 50s.
I'm actually late 50s almost, right? I'm pushing 57.
You know, we look like we're in our late 20s.
But the thing is, we also want, and it also, and there are also issues there for us around aging, but we'll put a pin in that. I needed to make a decision about what I thought I could do to contribute to some sort of conscious resistance.
So we got a place in the country. It is on conservation protected land, so it can't be developed. It can't even really be farmed. We have a modest home, you can see in the background. And on our land, there's also a barn and a wood shop and potential for lots of stuff. We also have a big vegetable garden, and we have a couple of chickens, and we now have a couple guinea fowl.
Not recommended.
And and so, you know, our plan, and it's actually already happening, is to start art residency program / land art / we don't know, lots of different things project. And we've landed on the name of FAR, Feminist Art Residency, like FAG, Feminist Art Gallery. Also, we're excited about that name because it can act as an acronym for all kinds of stuff, like Fatties Are Rad, to
Feminist Artists Respite,
to all kinds of stuff.
We thought there were more, but
there's so many.
We're working on that.
I don't want to just go off the top of my head because it, you know, it can go in a weird way, but
well, it's also, I mean, we have enough space to do big projects, land art projects, ideally permanent or temporary land art projects. We do have already an artist in residence.
Our first artist in residence started last week.
Yes, who's painting, drawing, and writing a book in a week.
The artist's name is Cyrus Marcus Ware.
And we have also been brainstorming with a couple of other really interesting thinkers who have worked at institutions before, do work for institutions now, but who have run residency programs. So we've been doing some brainstorming with an artist, Johnson No, and have had a couple of different folks walk through who have given us some really great ideas and opportunities, including Emily Shanger, who's now at the Agnes Etherington, also known as the Agnes. And so, you know, we're bringing in people to kind of inform the process.
I also want to mention too that like a lot of in the winter time, we did a lot of reading about permaculture and artist residencies. But in the permaculture literature, I mean, it's so interesting, which is like about living in a way that supports the land, not the land supporting you.
Right.
But in all the reading, it's like, why is all this stuff attributed to white European dudes, thinkers, and knew that there was a piece missing, or that is indigenous knowledge, that is so obvious. So now we're thinking alongside authors like Canadian artist Dolene Manning, who's an indigenous writer and, you know, works with multiple kind of like areas around art and knowledge, including disability arts and indigenous art and feminist queer stuff. So her work, and so we're going to have a brainstorming session, not as big as, because we can't, in September with these folks here in this place to, with Emily, Dolene, Johnson, and potentially a couple other folks to think through around, and Cyrus, sorry, to think through around what will our art residency be and what will it be like? So it's meant to, ours right now, it's unformed, but in our minds, we were hoping it would be something that is like acts as a place of support, of respite, relaxation, no demands, no production required. How can we support you for a week or whatever the amount of time is? But that's what we're thinking now, but we haven't had our brainstorming yet. So we'll likely shift and move because we don't want to be stuck with where our tiny minds entered the dream. We want the dream to be expanded by the connection with others.
And since leaving Toronto, we've been able to do things like think about what it means to regulate and adjust, or, you know, think about the moving from pattern to details, things that permaculture informs, or indigenous knowledge informs you through, instead of trying to figure out why the Queen streetcar is not coming and it's been an hour and 15 minutes. You know, like we've gotten ourselves out of that, I mean, it's not a hustle and bustle. Large cities right now are kind of imploding. Toronto is a city in a state of destruction in some ways. So, you know, to be able to leave that for some green space really is helping us recalibrate so that we can actually move forward as artists and continue to make art, or find ways to create sustainable communities gathered around some of the things that we value so most about cultural production.
To me, that is the art making.
Yeah.
Like that, not making material objects. I have no interest in doing that anymore right now, but it's the art making right now is this, you know, what they call, some people call world making.
Yeah.
Where it's about trying new ways of being in the world, experimenting, taking some risks in a social, outside
More
way.
sustainable.
Some of the ways that the pandemic has pushed us towards, but also in the ways that a lot of social justice movements have been pushing us towards for a long time.
Yeah. So that hybridity of art and activism that we kind of experimented with FAG has now moved into another kind of next level version of that. And ultimately, you know, questions of land ownership, of course, and trying to understand our role will be infinitely more complicated here than it would have been in an urban center, because in an urban center, well, it's because it's
think about where we were in Parkdale in relation to neighbors, and I don't know, I think that was as complicated.
Well, I guess what I'm thinking though is that at this time in our lives, based on what we know and what we've done, and now looking at the choices that we made, it's like an almost, I guess it begs the question, what are we going to do? And in the city, it seemed like we were always too busy to ask, you know, or to have the space and the clarity or the oxygen around you to ask the question after, you know, making art for 25 years, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With what we know.
With what we know. Which is a lot of, there's a lot of options. What do you think?
Can I just tie what you're saying back to something that you said last April when we first talked to you about the Feminist Art Field School? At that point, we were thinking that the pandemic would end quickly enough for us to host the field school in person in Victoria in the summer. And you said that you would come, but that you wanted to do nothing. So you've started to hint at that in your current commentary. But to put the question in a succinct way, have you figured out how to do nothing, and is doing nothing a feminist gesture or practice?
Well, we were just talking about this yesterday, in fact. And I was even talking to somebody who I'm working with doing some counseling right now, that doing nothing, understanding what that means. I mean, the privilege of being able to bow out, that I think comes through whiteness and our age, that we already have established networks. So to bow out or to do nothing has less implications. You know, like the politics of refusal can be, can often come from a place of entitlement. So there's that piece to think about. But also like trying to understand, you know, like I was saying that I had recounted our conversation about wanting to do nothing, and how you had said, yeah, that sounds good. But then we would still go there to do nothing, which I don't even really know what that means. And like, what's the carbon impact of flying to Victoria to do nothing? It seems like it'd be better to be here, put a green screen behind us with like Cadborough Bay. And then we were joking around and like, what would it mean in an interview with you two to do nothing? Like, it'd be a bit like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
But
know
then
if
we could really follow that path and think like what comes from that, right? Like I'm genuinely interested in some of those questions and possibilities for all of the ways in which even the field school is trying to break out of traditional disciplinary modes and models, and to democratize the platforms, and to think collectively about what a field school even is, or what these categories and containers like feminism and art and practice mean. We're still congealing into familiar modes and forms. And I'm really interested in the tensions and the pushes and pulls, or the suggestions of nothing, and then thinking how quickly nothing becomes something.
Yeah.
And so
or
it leads me
self-improvement in some way. Yeah.
Right. And how do you do nothing well? Or how do you do nothing in a way that will feel satisfying? I mean, it's all different versions of a trap. But it strikes me that, you know, one of the things that we're trying to think out loud about in the field school together is, you know, the role of institutions. And I wonder, you know, what role, if any, you think institutions, however we might want to define that word, can play in crafting better futures.
Yeah. Better futures. Well, first of all, I don't know what's good and what's bad.
Second of all, I don't know what future is, but also a better one.
Well, okay, let me just pick up a piece of the wanting to do nothing. is also about not wanting to participate in an environmentally destructive white supremacist colonial system. That's a piece about the doing nothing. That we're trying to look at having less impact in those ways that are through consumerism, professionalization of artists and thinkers, and the co-optation of our ideas. And this is often the thing that institutions, or even incredible, beautiful, rad people within institutions, are like, okay, I'm in this place of power. I mean, I know I do it at the university all the time. What can I do with that will stop a gatekeeping system, open opportunities for people, allow people to access what they think that they want to access? How can I leverage what I have access to shift the system? But then it feels kind of like actually a fool's errand sometimes, or like you're just doing the good job of indoctrinating a new generation into that pace and into the belief of trying to attain those goals of whether it's like grants or exhibitions or public programming or web content, all that stuff, exposure, fame, all that jazz.
Well, and here's the rub too, is that doing nothing is still something. So, you know, I mean, not that this happened, but it happens to us all the time. It's like, we're going to do nothing. It's like, that sounds great. Can you send us a description? And then you're like, oh God, okay, I got to write a description. And oh my God, I was supposed to send that 2 days ago. And I had this thing in
I'm a loser.
my computer now.
I'm letting
like,
my friend down.
I have a thing in my computer. It's like, this is 5 days overdue.
I'll
like,
never be a good
don't
artist.
Talk to me about that. So, you know, there's this thing that starts to happen where, you know, so maybe it's not really about doing nothing. It's about the stopping the doing of the things that are that perpetuate a kind of expectation. So we double back all the way back to the reasons that I became involved in artist run culture was to upset that system. And I have done nothing, if I've done anything, I've done nothing really to ultimately challenge that. I've critiqued it. I've been public about my disappointment in that system. We dedicated 10 years of our lives to a gallery that was set up to trouble that notion. But really, I've just become part of that, just the unpaid, lesser, least important part of that, right? So the squeaky wheel does not get the grease. It gets a wall built up, you know, between the institution that doesn't want to hear it and you. So, you know, in some ways, it creates a kind of scar tissue, right? You continue to try to build something out of like a critique, and you end up part of that critique.
But that was I feel like partly that was like generational for us to learn about critique and what some people call the paranoid reading, or the, you know, trying to show people that there's a problem. I do think that, back to your question about how we can make a better world or how institutions can be involved in that. And one of the things that comes to mind that feels like the only way is to open up those places so that they're not controlled by white settlers. They're not controlled by cis men. That there are more people people who have been intentionally kept out of the leadership and direction, or even when they were brought in was just for optics and they actually had no power and couldn't make things happen, or they got like burnt out by trying, or, you know, all those things. That the only way that institutions can contribute to making a better world is to get white people, white settler people, to move aside, give up the power, and give the land back, give the museums back, give the universities back, everything. Just like stop hoarding, stop controlling, and stop, open up the coffers, open up your wallets, all that stuff. Just like stop doing that.
The carbon footprint of museums and the waste generating cycles of museums are extraordinary. I mean, not apart from, but in addition to the critique around whiteness and the institution, come all these other really complicated narratives around their ecology.
Yeah, it's beyond just like complaining that there's too much group of 7 exhibitions.
Yeah.
It's like much bigger than that.
Yeah. So, back to the art, we were thrilled when you accepted our proposition of doing nothing, but we're kind of hardwired to do something, or maybe the nothing is a kind of stopping doing the same thing that we were doing in favor of giving space and air and time around the consideration of what to do or how to do what's next. I think that our move here was, it's fraught and complicated in many ways, as we've already mentioned, because we now own 64 acres of conservation protected land that we need to figure out how to, we've already tried to do a little bit of research on how you actually do give it back, which is apparently very complicated.
It's
and
not
difficult.
Easy. It can take 25 years or longer.
So maybe that's where we should focus some of our artistic energy, but also, getting back to the idea of it being a space for people to come and just, I don't know, to figure out for themselves the same thing that we're trying to figure out. And that can be a combination of making art, having a workshop, reading, writing, sleeping. And so ultimately we're here to we're trying to manifest something that's still a bit unknown to us. And so there's a nothing space there that if we don't,
we're just trying not to fill it.
Let it be alone. If we fill it with something, we might miss the opportunity to figure it out better.
And I want to say one more thing, which is that like something we've learned from the teaching, that from lessons that we've learned from Cyrus Marcus Ware and his perspective, which is this idea that we have to be able to dream and imagine and let our minds open up to be able to know what that future could possibly be. Because if we're stuck in a rat race or spinning our wheels around productivity and all those kinds of things, then we'll never be able to contribute to making a better world. I can't hear.
Are you sure?
Your stomach just grumbles really loud.
I'm hungry.
I think that is a beautiful note to end on. And the other thing that Cyrus always says is that we have to make the revolution irresistible.
Yeah.
Can you say that in the? Can you quote him in the chat so that when people are looking at that's actually that's the best last word for sure.
That's a great lesson. And thank you for helping to do that.
Thanks for joining us.
We would like to continue to talk to the two of you about this. And I know that the Feminist Field School is something that you have attached to the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria and your work out on the West Coast. But, we would be very open to the Feminist Field School doing something here. We'd be very open to both of you coming here,
of course,
separately and or together. You can gather around you people that you would like to spend time with. That may be no one. I mean, I'm dying. I'm like, hi, Cyrus. I was like,
Leave him
he's
alone.
he's been in there, like literally alone for 5 days now.
He comes and has dinner with
I know, but
us.
it's beautiful to see that kind of focus.
It's interesting to
and
figure
intention.
out. It's also interesting to figure out, like, how do we support you without bugging you? So it's like text, we're going to have dinner around 8 o'clock if you want to join us. You know, it's like not like, hey, Cyrus, what you doing?
I know, but maybe I guess it's not, I could continue this conversation forever.
But I gotta go.
But you gotta go. But I just wanted to say sometimes the doing nothing is when you can do nothing, you should do nothing, because like to leave Cyrus alone is the best thing. That's what Cyrus wants.
And to
right?
pay attention to how hard your impulse to.
I know. I'm a pleaser.
And just like let your
pleasing addict.
recognize it and
rub your own shoulders.
rub your own shoulders. Rub your own shoulders.